Good evening. My name is Peter Stevens. I'm the Director of Enterprise Partnerships for the University of South Australia. As you can tell, I am not Jacinta Thompson. Jacinta is currently on leave, so it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you all to the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationships with the land, and acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight as we hear from Emeritus Professor Hugh White, one of Australia's most respected strategic thinkers, as he explores the themes of his insightful essay, Hard New World, Our Post-American Future. And he'll be joined in conversation with Misha Ketchell tonight, the editor of the conversation. The session is being recorded and will be available on the Hawke Centre website next week, and we encourage you to bring this to the attention of friends and colleagues who could not be here tonight. We're also live streaming the presentation, and I welcome our online audience. And as we are filming, can I please ask you to switch your phones to silent to avoid interruptions if you haven't already done so. Professor Hugh White AO is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. He's been an intelligence analyst, a journalist, senior staffer to Australian Defence Minister Kim Beazley and Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and a senior official in the Australian Defence Department. Professor White is also a member of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre Advisory Board, which we thank him very much for. Tonight she will be in conversation with Misha. Misha is the editor and executive director of The Conversation. In Australia and New Zealand, has been a journalist for more than 25 years. He was the founding editor of The Big Issue in Australia and editor of Crikey, The Reader and The Melbourne Weekly. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hugh White and Misha Ketchell for what promises to be a compelling and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everybody for coming tonight. We're here to discuss Hugh's latest quarterly essay, Hard New World. Some of you may not have noticed that actually this is the fourth in a series of quarterly essays talking about and developing a theme that dates back to 2010 when Hugh first published on this issue. And the issue he's looking at is the global strategic realignment, in particular Australia's relationship with the United States and Australia's relationship with Asia and its sort of role in Asia. And as you can tell from the title, it does contain some bad news. Hard News World is not necessarily entirely optimistic. So what I wanted to do was to start by asking Hugh about the soft old world that this is replacing. Now, in the year 2000, Hugh, you wrote the Australian Defence White Paper, and I think that's a moment really before these changes that you're sort of talking about started to really come about. Can you describe what the sort of geopolitical landscape looked like at that point?
Yeah, it's a really good place to start, Misha. But look, can I just start by saying thank you very much for joining me in this conversation. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction, and thanks to the Bob Hawke Centre for bringing us all together, and Renee for making it all happen. As Peter mentioned, I worked for Bob, and I'm very proud to be associated with the centre here, so it's a particular pleasure for me to have a conversation about this subject with such a nice big audience and with Misha tonight. So what was it like? I mean, you go back to 2000, which is, not a bad sort of hinge point. And we really were at the end of the 90s, the end of the post-Cold War decade, where it did seem that we'd entered into a world which was, Francis Fukuyama's famous phrase, now become kind of a punchline, the end of history, but it did mean something. There was a thought that the United States was going to be unchallengeably preponderant in every dimension of national power for as far ahead as we could see, that it would exercise that astonishing power benevolently, that its global leadership, and remember, people did talk about it as the new Rome. They had to reach back to the Roman Empire to have an example of a country that exercised the kind of influence, but not just in where the Roman Empire existed, but globally. No country in history had ever exercised that kind of influence globally. And it was thought that this would be not just benevolent by the United States, but also would be accepted by every other major power. There are always going to be some dissidents. We called them the rogue states, the Irans, the North Koreas, the Iraqs. But the big players, the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, the Europeans, would all accept American leadership. And people seriously argued that there would be really no basis for major international wars in the future because there was nothing to fight about. That, in a sense, was what the end of history line was about. And on top of that, there was the sense that having seen the end of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain having come down, democratisation was spreading, and it really was spreading. I mean, if you think of the democratisation of Eastern Europe after the collapse of the communist regimes, if you think of the emergence of democracy in Indonesia, in South Korea, in Taiwan, I mean, you could be very optimistic in 2000 that democracy was the wave of the future, and I thought that it would start to retreat in the West. In America, that just seemed unthinkable.
Just as a matter of interest, because you were working on the Defence White Paper, were you thinking about any of these things at that point?
Well, you're tempting me to tell a story to my advantage, so you'll be wise to discount what I'm about to say. But seriously, no, it did seem to me, and not just to me, but it did seem to me that behind this optimism there were some important counter-indications. And one of them was that we were seeing, contrary to the idea that America was going to be unchallengeably preponderant in every dimension of national power, it was clear, and you might, I think, be fair to say, particularly in Australia, that what was happening in China, what had started actually 20 years before with Deng Xiaoping's, the beginning of Deng Xiaoping's opening up of China economically. But, if I can just draw a graph in the air, China had got to there, and clever people who understood about these things were expecting that it would go like that. And it did. And we did, I'm going to allow myself to say the white paper says, actually, in words very much like this, that if China's rise continues the way it has, China has, for the next couple of decades, then China will acquire the kind of weight and power which has traditionally been associated with countries that seek to challenge the existing international order. And we should therefore at least recognise the possibility that in the decades to come, we might face an Asia, in particular an East Asia, in which the US and China in which China significantly challenged America's place as the region's leading power, and therefore that the US and China would become strategic rivals, and that would therefore make our situation much harder, and therefore we had to spend a bit more on defence. And that was actually the sort of the big underlying argument in the white paper. But that was a kind of you might say, a sort of a prudent judgment for defence policymakers to make. But it didn't really detract from the great sense of optimism that what we now call, we didn't use this phrase at the time, but what we now call the rules-based order was going to make a world in which it was going to be very easy, in which Australia was going to be very secure, and was going to be very easy for Australia to be prosperous, and in which the sorts of values and ideas that underpin our political ideology were on the way to becoming universal and uncontested. And, the point about hard new world is that now seems very remote, and I don't think we've yet woken up to how remote it's become.
So let me contrast that moment of optimism with a little sense that things might be changing in a way that is going to present some challenges, to another moment earlier this year, before the federal election, when you were watching Vladimir Zelensky in the White House with Donald Trump and JD Vance. I think you described this as one of the most remarkable and disturbing diplomatic encounters ever filmed. Why do you say that? Why do you describe that in such strong terms? And also, how does that moment, which some people might say is a moment of political theatre or Donald Trump wackiness, how does that actually tie into the broader changes in your view of the role of America in the world?
Yeah. No, really good way to frame it. Look, most of you probably do remember it. It was pretty remarkable. There were two things about that which I thought were really striking. The first was that, of course, it was a reflection of what had happened and was happening in Ukraine. It did seem to me that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the point at which the potential for serious challenges to US global leadership moved from being something that was, well, I shouldn't say the potential, I mean the actuality of serious challenges to US global leadership, which had been building for quite a long time. Putin had been actively expressing his discontent with the idea of that US-led order. As early as 2007, he gave a big speech in Munich about that. The Chinese, although they didn't make the speeches because that's not their way, had, I think, clearly begun to press their case for taking America's place as a leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific from about 2008 or 2010, around that kind of time. And so we'd already seen a lot of, movement towards the idea of a globally contested international order in which America's position was under pressure. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the first time that was reflected by a great power actually using armed force in what you might, a very traditional and very scarily traditional kind of way. And, Russia wasn't just any old power. It remained, despite the fact that it's a lot weaker than it was in its heyday as the Soviet Union, it still remained a country with, amongst other things, massive nuclear forces. And so it seemed to me that the background to that extraordinary scene in the Oval Office was this very stark challenge to the US-led global order by Russia. And the second point is that the ineffectiveness of the Western response, which was already clear before that occasion, because when Russia first invaded Ukraine, we all agreed that Russia had to be decisively defeated if the international order was going to be defended, and I think that was right. And the problem is Russia wasn't decisively defeated. I mean, decisive defeat for Russia meant essentially, slight oversimplification, but not much, that Russia needed to be pushed out of all Ukrainian territory it had occupied, and Ukraine needed to be welcomed into NATO. That's what a real win would look like. And by the time Zelensky met Trump and Vance in the Oval Office, in fact, well before that, it was clear that neither of those things were going to happen. Whatever happens, however the process, which is unfolding very slowly, if at all at the moment, is resolved, Russia is going to end up occupying a fair bit of Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine's going to be out of NATO. Now, against that background, we have an America which is anyway managing what seems to me to be a very serious erosion of the international order that we'd all hoped would obtain, and which I'm kind of arguing in the essay, I think the Australian governments are still kind of in a muddled way hoping would obtain. We'd already seen this very significant erosion, and then we see it dramatised by one of the most inhumane displays by the leader of a great power to a leader of another country, probably ever. I mean, there's a famous account of the way Hitler dealt with the president of Czechoslovakia in 1938 after the Munich surrender, but that wasn't on television. This was on television. And Trump, at the end of it, on camera, said, "This is going to make great television." Now, you could talk for half an hour about what that means. But at any rate, I do think what it showed was that it showed us things about Trump. It showed us things about J.D. Vance, who I think is a pretty significant figure, not just your average vice president, if I could put it this way. And it showed us things about the America which had placed these men men who displayed what one can only call the deficiencies in their character in the way they dealt with this courageous and embattled man. The American voters had put them where they were, and that's got to tell us something about America.
So in terms of the broader argument in your essay, we're putting all our eggs in the basket of relying on America as a powerful ally, and you're saying that in that moment you saw via Ukraine that America is not that powerful, and you also saw that America is not that reliable or loyal as an ally. And so those two things were the reason that was such a source of sort of dismay, I think. I think my question is, a lot of people argue about Donald Trump that he's an aberrant character, he's an unusual individual. To
Hard
some
to
extent,
disagree with that.
Sorry? Yeah.
Hard to disagree with
To
that.
some extent, you could say the same of JD Vance.
Yeah.
So there is one school of thought that you can just wait it out.
Yeah.
You know, that we went back to the Biden administration.
Yep.
The Biden administration sort of normalised relationships somewhat with Australia and a whole range of allies. You don't think that's the case? Why not?
No, I don't think it's the case, and I think it's not the case for two reasons. The first is Trump himself. He is, a very, very unusual character, to put it mildly. But I think it's a big mistake to see him as an aberration. Just electorally, there's a wonderful map that the New York Times does, which has a little arrow on the map of the United States for every county. There's something like 3,800 counties in the United States. And the arrow shows how the votes moved in each of those counties in successive elections. And one of the maps shows those counties in the United States in which the Republican vote in successive presidential elections went up every time from 2012 to 2016 to 2020 to 2024. In other words, the election before Trump got into the business and the three elections in which Trump was the Republican candidate. Almost half of all American counties, the vote for Trump went up on each of those three elections compared to the election before. So what that tells us is the more American voters, and a lot of American voters, see of Donald Trump, the more they like him. Scarier still, so those counties are shown with red arrows, and the map is a mass of red arrows. Scarier still, the number of blue arrows, the ones that show the Democrat vote increasing in all three of those elections, which is what you'd expect, as a whole lot of people see more of Donald Trump and are more and more determined to vote against him. There are hardly any. It's just a handful of them. So one thing I have to say about Donald Trump is that he's not a transitory character, he's not an aberration in the sense that he does seem to reflect a robust and well-entrenched electoral trend in the United States. The second point is that, it is just worth asking yourself, what happens in 2028? Now, there are three possibilities, actually. One is that Trump stands himself, and just because the 22nd Amendment says he's not allowed to, doesn't mean he won't. But even if he doesn't, even if somebody else stands, like JD Vance, what are the chances that if Trump or his nominee is not elected, there will be a peaceful transfer of power to a Democratic president? I mean, there were real doubts about that happening in 2024. We were only saved from that from the fact that Trump won. So I think, we really, there's temptation, and I'm as tempted to do this as anybody. I mean, it's important to make the point, I guess. I'm a basically very pro-American kind of guy. I've worked with Americans a lot of my career. A lot of my career was spent working on the US alliance. I've never lived in Washington, but I spent a lot of time in Washington, and I have had at times earlier in my career a great respect for and affection for the US system. But I do think, it's got a real problem. And the last point I just make is that it's not just Trump, in the sense that Trump, though he is himself a remarkable character, could only have managed his extraordinary commandeering of the American political system if other elements of that system were much weaker than we thought. I mean, when we first saw Trump ride down that escalator in the Trump Tower in 2016 and into the Republican presidential primary race, everybody, including me, said, this is just absurd. How can this bloke with, no credentials and no talent and a huge number of liabilities and the most awe-inspiring, horrible things recorded on him on tape. This person cannot be nominated as the candidate for a great American political party. Yes, he could. Then we said, well, this person can't win because the other political party will campaign effectively against him. No, they can't. And so that, there's something deep has gone wrong. So I do think Trump and the movement he represents does constitute something of a revolution in American politics.
Let me just turn that on its head for a moment, because despite all the ways in which Trump is deplorable and the ways in which you can say things have gone wrong, you also argue in the essay that, in a way, Trump's approach to geopolitics, to positioning America in the world, is actually something going right.
Yeah.
Because it's more honest, and it's more accordant with the actual reality of what's going on. Can you maybe talk more about that?
No, exactly. So here's the whole other side of the argument.
Yep.
And in the end, although I do think Trump is a terrifically important phenomenon, in the end, this is the more important part of the argument. It's the argument that makes me so sure that we're in a post-American world. And just to be clear, I don't mean America disappears, it just means it doesn't play the kind of role we thought it would be playing back in 2000 in that soft old world that we like to think of. And that is that there are really deep underlying forces which to me mean that the United States is most unlikely, almost impossible, that the United States continues to play the role we thought it was going to play in the 1990s and 2000, and which I think Australian political parties are still expecting the United States to play. And that is because, there's, in the end, countries, do shape their international posture around a kind of broad understanding of their interests and imperatives. And there's a reason why America stepped back from isolationism, abandoned isolationism, which had worked so well for it in the 19th century, as it moved into the 20th century, and why throughout the 20th century, and particularly in its latter part, they made such huge commitments to taking on the kind of global leadership that they did after the Second World War. And that is that they were really scared of something. They were scared of a country becoming powerful enough to dominate the whole of Eurasia, and therefore being able to threaten the United States at home in the Western Hemisphere. And only a country that could do that, only a country that was so powerful that it could dominate the whole of the Eurasian landmass, could threaten the United States at home. Because, in the Western Hemisphere, as Trump keeps on saying, surrounded by those big, beautiful oceans, America is itself very secure. Now, during this, what the First World War was about, to a certain extent, it was what the Second World War was very much about. They feared that Germany and Japan would dominate the whole of Eurasia. And it's absolutely what the Cold War was about. And they had this very strong sense that if the Soviet Union was not contained within the boundaries roughly that was established at the end of the Second World War, if it occupied Western Europe, if it could exploit its alliance with China, which of course it had at the beginning, if it would become more influential in India and in Southeast Asia, it would end up dominating the whole of Eurasia, and then it would be strong enough to threaten the United States at home. And that's why they spent that extraordinary, for decades, spent extraordinary sums of money and took extraordinary risks, including the risk of nuclear war, in order to contain the Soviet Union. Now, that imperative seems to me to have gone, because the world we're in today, it's not a world in which the United States has unipolar power, but it's not a world in which any other country is going to have unipolar power either. We live in a genuinely multipolar world. There are a lot of very powerful states around, and that's a reflection of the fact that over the last few decades, we have lived through one of the most revolutionary redistributions of wealth and power globally that we've seen in the whole of history. I mean, there was a massive redistribution of wealth and power during the Industrial Revolution, when the countries that used to have the most power, which were China and India, not that India was quite a country, China was, but those conglomerations with huge populations had the biggest economies because, roughly speaking, every person produced about the same amount of output when they were all basically subsistence or semi-subsistence farmers. The Industrial Revolution changed that fundamentally and introduced the era which we're all such a product of, in which power and wealth was concentrated in the hands of essentially Europeans and North Americans, with the Japanese as a special case. Now the Industrial Revolution has spread to China and in a different way spreading to India. We now have a genuinely multipolar distribution of power around the world again, with America, of course, still. America is not disappearing. It's going to be one of the most powerful states in the world, but India and China and Russia in a different way, and I think Europe, a kind of united Europe, are going to all be very powerful states. No country is going to be able to dominate Eurasia because there's going to be so much power distributed so evenly amongst those different countries. And therefore America doesn't have the same anxiety that it had in the 20th century, and so it won't have the same imperative to commit itself to a global leadership. And we can see this, although, and here's the mismatch, in Washington, I think through what you might call nostalgia and sheer policy momentum, they still talk about, or some people still talk about maintaining global leadership and talk as if China might be that kind of challenge, the same kind of challenge as the Soviet Union posed. But it's pretty clear that no one in Washington really takes that seriously because they haven't responded the way you'd expect them to respond. In the 20th century, in the Cold War, when the United States really did fear that the Soviet Union would challenge them in the way I described, they spent, in the 50s, 10% of GDP on defence. In the 60s and 70s, they were still spending 7 and 8% of GDP in defence, and into right through to the end of the Cold War, they were still spending 6 and 7% of GDP on defence, compared to 3.5% today. What they've in fact done is keep spending. They bounced up a bit during the War on Terror, but they're spending the amount of money they spent at the end of the decline that went through the 90s, at the end of the Cold War, when they thought they were going to live in a world with no serious challenges. Now, to my mind, and you can see the same in Asia, specifically in our part of the world. In the decade, almost, 2017 is when America really started talking big about resisting the Chinese. We haven't seen any substantial increase in America's military position in the Western Pacific. We haven't seen any substantial increase in its diplomatic presence or its economic engagement. On the contrary, we've seen largely withdrawal. So I think when you look at what the United States has actually done, there's a lot more isolationists around in Washington than just Donald Trump. And oddly enough, Donald Trump's instinct to pull back, his instinct, as he said in that terrible thing with Zelensky, he said, we're not really worried about what happens to Ukraine. That actually reflects a pretty deep understanding, and I don't think they're worried about what happens in Asia. And that seems to be a view which is supported by a lot of American voters, which is why in the long run I don't think we're going to see them sticking around.
And, for example, if the Democrats return to power, you don't really see that changing? You think that fundamental realignment?
I don't. I mean, I think one of the things, of course, obviously the Democrats are going to have to go through an extraordinary process to make themselves competitive again after the sort of serial catastrophe of their campaign last year with the Biden and all the rest of it. But, the one thing that, and the Democrats at the moment seem to be an extremely fractious group of people, but one thing they all do seem to agree on is they need to rethink some pretty fundamental things. And one thing I think they're going to have to rethink is the proposition that they can keep on selling the American people on the idea that they can preserve global leadership without really making sacrifices. And Joe Biden talked about winning the contest with China for the 21st century in sort of very big and bold language, but he was not prepared to do what was required to make that real. Just as he talked very boldly about defeating Russia and pushing it back and humiliating it, but he was not prepared to do what was required to prevent the Russians achieving what seems to me to be, tragically, a pretty significant victory in their campaign in Ukraine.
Okay. So at the moment when the US is sort of retreating from its role as global protector, you've written 3 quarterly essays talking about these changes, and the Australian government, Scott Morrison, says, AUKUS, that's what we want. We want this real strong relationship with the United States, which involves both the supply of submarines to us, but also our tying really our sort of geostrategic strategy to the US very strongly. Last week, or the week before last, I think, Paul Keating came out and criticised Richard Marles, and he said, Yesterday's statement by Defence Minister Richard Marles that Australia's geography and continent would be crucial to any United States prosecution of a war against China will go down as a dark moment in Australian history.
Yeah.
Now, Keating's argument was that Marles is effectively tying us to the US in a way that, to some extent, sells our sovereignty and puts us under threat or puts us in a more sort of combative relationship with China than we need to be.
Yep.
Do you think that's right?
Yes, I do. I mean, I wouldn't put things as colourfully as Paul puts them. It's only one person in the world uses language like Paul Keating. But I think we'd be, and I wouldn't always agree with some of the ways he used language, but I do think his underlying point is absolutely valid and very important. The fact is that, over the last, well, I say from 2017 was the year, as it happens, that both in Washington and in Canberra, a political leadership started declaring that China was a strategic rival and we had to worry about it. And before then, they tried to pretend that wasn't happening. But really, in a sense, the process began when Barack Obama came to Canberra when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister in 2011 and stood up in our Parliament and announced his pivot to Asia, which was all about responding to China's growing power and ambition. And at the same time, well, actually the next day, went to Darwin and announced the deployment of US Marines to Darwin, which was a very significant new policy initiative. The first time we'd had US combat forces routinely operating from Australian territory since the Second World War. So this was a real deal. And since then, the broad pattern of Australian policy has to be to commit ourselves more and more closely to supporting the United States' declared policy of pushing back against China, including a declared policy of trying to deter China from challenging America's leading position in Asia by threatening to go to war to prevent it. Now, for the reason I touched on before, I don't actually think, although that's been declared US policy of at least of Democrat administrations, if not of Trump administrations, it's just a bit unclear what the rest of the Trump administration thinks about that. We know what Trump himself thinks. But notwithstanding the fact that it's declared policy, the US has actually not done anything very substantive to implement that. But one thing they have done is tried to pull Australia more and more closely into that approach. And Australia has very willingly gone along with it. I think what really, and AUKUS, of course, is a very important part of that. I mean, AUKUS is two things, at least. One is it's a plan to acquire submarines. We might come back to that.
Yeah.
But the other thing, and in a sense more important, more fundamental, is it's a declaration of strategic alignment with the United States in the US declared policy of trying to resist China's challenge to US leadership in Asia by being willing to go to war with China to stop it. Now, I think that is a really bad policy to align oneself with for two reasons. The first is I don't think the Americans are serious about it because they haven't done what's necessary to make it real. The other thing is I'm sure it wouldn't work for the simple reason I don't think the United States can win a war with China, and more to the point, I don't think they can convince the Chinese that they believe they can win a war with China and therefore they can't actually deter the Chinese, because it's very hard to deter someone by promising to fight a war when the other guy knows that you can't win it. And that is, I mean, literally...
But also, the other guy knows that you're saying domestically that you're not into international wars.
Exactly.
So...
Exactly. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm so convinced that the US is not really serious about the policy that we're working so hard to integrate ourselves with is that no American political leader has been prepared to stand up and tell the American public that if they want to preserve leadership in Asia, if they want to win the contest with China for the 21st century, which was one of Biden's slogans, they're going to have to be willing to fight a war with the most powerful adversary they've ever confronted, because China is more powerful relative to the United States than any country has been since the Americans overtook the British in probably about 1890, something like that. And in particular, no American president has whispered to the American public that this might be a nuclear war, which it almost certainly would be. Now, that's a really big contrast with the Cold War. What you saw the United States do in the Cold War US political leaders was to go out there and explain to the American public, A, that 7-8% of their GDP, which that's a lot, was going to defence, but also that at critical moments, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like the Berlin Crisis in 1961, they explained with absolute clarity that achieving America's strategic objectives would require the United States to fight a nuclear war which could easily include attacks on American cities. And American voters, this is a remarkable thing, which I still don't quite understand, but American voters said, yeah, all right. Now, the fact is, no one dares mention that in US politics today, which shows you how unserious it is. And that shows how dumb it is of us to align ourselves with that. Now, the point that Keating was making was that the more we say to the United States, either by signing up to AUKUS or to accepting, for example, the basing or the rotational operation of B-52s out of Darwin, in a setting which, as Keating says correctly, is quite unambiguously intended as a preparation for the possibility of military operations against China during a US-China war, and potentially nuclear operations, because there is a question as to what other kind of munitions would you bother carrying all the way from Tyndall to China. It is quite a long way, a very expensive way of delivering high explosive. So I think, Keating is making the point that we are putting ourselves in a position of increasingly encouraging the United States to think that we are willing to go to war to support them in a conflict with China, when...
At a point when they're sort of retreating.
Well, the point that, A, they're not serious about it,
yeah.
and the point that we haven't decided whether, we haven't had a national conversation about whether that would be a good idea. And I think he thinks, I shouldn't put words in his mouth, but I think he thinks, no, I'll put it differently, I think that our governments haven't actually seriously thought about this. And so they're just allowing themselves to drift down, down the river towards the waterfall without asking themselves whether this is really something we should be letting ourselves into. And the reason for that is very simple. That is, I think, I'm going to say Canberra, by which I mean political leadership, and of course on both sides of politics, there's not really a cigarette paper between them on this, and the official community that surrounds them, the bureaucrats and so on, simply cannot imagine Australia making its way in an Asia which is not dominated and made safe for us by the United States, because it's always been that way, or at least it's been that way since, let's pick a date, February 1942 with the fall of Singapore, and before then it was Britain. It is a peculiarity of our national history that ever since European settlement in 1788, either Britain or America, successively, one after the other, has been the world's strongest economy, the world's dominant maritime power, and the strongest strategic player in Asia. And our great mates, our best buddies. And
although, when it came down to it,
of course, I mean, what we learn is it only works. I mean, that's what Singapore told us, that actually all alliances are transactional. And so, Britain in the end was only prepared to commit itself to this part of the world when it was in their interests. In the end, it wasn't in their interests because the distribution of wealth and power shifted. America has been prepared to commit itself as an ally to Australia because it's worked for America, and I don't criticise America for this, they're just doing their job. It's worked for America because having Australia as an ally has contributed to maintaining America's strategic presence in East Asia. But if America's not serious about maintaining its presence in East Asia, because the costs and risks of trying to do that in the face of China's challenge is higher than the imperatives require, then the United States is not going to do that. Whereas we're continuing to rely on them, and we're relying on them more and more in a region which is becoming more contested and potentially, and this is a bit of a complex point, but potentially in the longer term more dangerous. That's not to say I think China's a threat to us today, but I do think there are longer term questions there. And the problem for us, we have to work out how to make our way in that Asia in which the United States is no longer playing the kind of role it's played for so long.
So let me just pick up on that. So we had some audience questions, and one of the questions that came through before this event was about this idea of China being the enemy or the threat of China. So say we uncouple to some extent from the United States. We didn't see them as our protector. We weren't hitched to them in the way we are currently. To what extent would China be a threat to us? Would it be naive to think that we could just get along fine without America's protection?
No, really, really important question. I can only envisage one circumstance in which Australia would find itself threatened by China, threatened militarily by the China of today. And that is if we join the United States in a war against China. And that is, and if we did that, then for sure.
Yeah.
Other than that, I mean, you know, one's always got to allow a certain, you know, unpredictability in world events. But when I look at the China that we see today, I don't see it posing a military threat to Australia. And by the way, I don't regard the circumnavigation of the continent by a small task group of Chinese ships as posing a military threat to Australia. Anyone who thinks that's what a military threat looks like doesn't know what a military threat looks like. I mean, you know, that's not threatening. I mean, it's a message. Oh yeah, they were sending us a message, but the difference between sending a message and being a serious military threat. So the two further points though. China today, I don't believe, threatens Australia militarily, but we do have to recognise that the sorts of the over sort of broad situation in the decades to come, if I'm right about America's trajectory, are going to be different from the decades we've known in the past. Because in the past, we have been very confident, not just that China, or for that matter other major powers, haven't had any particular reason to attack Australia, but that even if they did have a reason, they couldn't, because the United States would be in the way. And the United States would both constrain them, so to speak, close to home, but then if it all turned to pear-shaped, then they would help defend us. Now, if we look 2 or 3 decades ahead, and just to make an important, maybe obvious point, 2 or 3 decades is not very long in this business. I mean, if we were ever to get any submarines under AUKUS, they'd only just be arriving, the British submarines. So this, you know, 2 or 3, when I say 2 or 3 decades, people think, oh, that's so far ahead, we don't have to worry about it. No, it's not. When we look 2 or 3 decades ahead,
planning, yeah.
it is possible, China will be in a position then, much more than it has been hitherto, to attack Australia if it wished to. If we're dealing with a China that's like the China we have today, which, you know, for all its faults, and it has some, I don't think there'd be any particular reason for us to fear that China would then take advantage of that increased opportunity. But there's a possibility that China will change as a country. I mean, countries do change. And so the risk that we have to manage when we think about developing an independent defence posture in the face of a declining US role is the risk that the China of 2050, say, is a different country from today and is more threatening. And I don't want to melodramatise it, but you know, the Japan of the 1870s didn't threaten Australia, and the Japan of the 1930s did, because they were different countries. The other point to make is that it's very easy to focus on China because it's the big story. But it's actually only one of 2 or 3 great powers in Asia over the decades to come. The other, of course, is India. We're not going to live in an Asia dominated by China. I think we're going to live in an East Asia in which China is the leading power. But in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, India will be the leading power. And India it's a different case from China. Its path to wealth and power is different. But I'm pretty sure it's going to get there. I mean, apart from anything else, the demographics, you know, there's 1.4 billion people. A lot of them are very talented. They're going to do something. And they certainly see themselves as a great power. So we're going to live in a bipolar, not just in a multipolar world, but in a multipolar Asia, with at least China and India players. And India, I think, is going to be a great power pretty much like China. I mean, it'll be different in all kinds of ways. But great powers, whether they're democracies or not, use their elbows. And I think we'll spend a fair bit of time worrying about how India is seeking to use its elbows, just as we worry about how China is seeking to use its elbows. And then there's Indonesia, which is the country that Australians have a genius for forgetting about. And the thing that people really need to remember about Indonesia is that on all the evidence, well before the middle of the century, Indonesia will have the 4th biggest economy in the world. It'll go, by say 2050, it'll go China, America, India, Indonesia. Now, Indonesia will have the inherent weight of a great power in its own right. Now, we are very used to thinking about Indonesia as big and close, but poor and weak. We still think of Indonesia that way. That is way out of date already. But well within the timeframes that are relevant, not just to our defence policy, but also to the broader thrust of our foreign policy, Indonesia will be a great power next door. Now, no particular reason to think Indonesia will threaten us, but, well, it's going to certainly smarten up the way we manage our relations with Jakarta. Yep. And again, I think it's a question of risk management for Australia to decide how should we prudently prepare for the possibility that a stronger Indonesia would, not the Indonesia of today, but the Indonesia that might emerge in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time, would pose a military threat to Australia. I don't think that's something we can dismiss.
Okay. Let me unpick the implications of your argument, because you made a very strong argument here about what the world's going to look like. We're facing a multipolar world of large powers, with some of them with nuclear capacity, so there's like a global power balance. Our relationship with the US is going to change whether we like it or not. I think, am I right in saying you're arguing that?
Yep.
Because it's not about us leaving the US, they're sort of leaving us to some extent anyway.
Yes, no, that's right, yes.
And then we've got some decisions to make. So one of those decisions, let's take an example, AUKUS. So we've got this AUKUS agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom. There's supposed to be some submarines coming in 2032, Virginia class, I think they're called. Then the big AUKUS subs come in after 2040.
Yeah. Long after 2040.
Yeah. And part of that deal, as you've sort of spelled out, we've got HMAS Sterling, there's the Tyndall Air Base. We're tied in with America in terms of if there's a conflict with China.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming your argument is we don't want that sort of arrangement. We don't want to be tied so closely to America. But also, if we are an independent power in Asia, the type of military hardware that we purchase and the way that we defend Australia would look different. Yep. Can you talk to me about that, how that would look different?
No, exactly. Look, as I said before, it's important to see AUKUS through 2 different lenses. One is the sort of lens of strategic alignment, and the other is a lens of capability acquisition. And for the reasons we've discussed, I think AUKUS it ties us to the wrong strategic alignment. But I also think it's a very dumb approach to capability acquisition, actually for 2 reasons. One is, I don't think we need nuclear-powered submarines, because exactly as you say, if you ask yourself, what kind of defence force should Australia build in order to manage the strategic risks that I mentioned, that is the risk that we find ourselves in a region in Asia dominated by great powers who may not, 20 or 30 years from now, be as unlikely to use armed force against us as they seem to be today. And, I think that's a significant risk that's worth, our thinking very carefully about. And I think one of the differences between our present situation, the situation we've known for so long, and the situation we now need to prepare for, is that we need to respond to that independently. We need the capacity to defend Australia independently from the forces that a major Asian power could project against us. And most Australians, most of the time, really ever since, European settlement, have taken it for granted that we can't do that Australia can't defend itself. I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong because it pays too little account of the huge advantages of our strategic geography. Big island, which makes a big difference, very long maritime approaches. And it pays too little attention to the fact that all of those maritime approaches, the fact that we are surrounded by a lot of air and a lot of water, are a huge operational advantage to us because the defence has big advantages over offence at sea. Now, it seems to me then that the task for us is to find the most cost-effective way to exploit those advantages, to enable us to prevent an adversary projecting power by air or sea against us. The reason I don't like nuclear-powered submarines as an option for Australia is that I don't think they're a very cost-effective way of doing that. Not that I don't think submarines are cost-effective in doing that, but I think nuclear-powered submarines, which have some big advantages for some purposes, actually don't have advantages for the purposes we need them for. Nuclear submarines...
They do have advantages for the purposes America might need them for.
Oh yes, if I was running the US Navy, I'd buy nuclear-powered submarines.
And you want Australia to buy them?
But if I was Australia, I wouldn't buy them. What we should be buying, I think, is a much larger fleet of conventionally powered submarines. Now, again, it's not that you know, if you gave the choice, I'd rather drive a nuclear-powered submarine than a conventionally powered submarine, just as I'd rather drive a Mercedes-Benz than a Hyundai. No disrespect to Hyundai owners. Yeah. But, you know, well, you would, wouldn't you? But the fact is, if you were running a taxi company, you wouldn't buy a Mercedes-Benz, would you? Numbers really count. And what we need is, with the best will in the world, no matter how they're powered, you're only going to have, at most, 1/3 or 1/4 of your fleet on station actually performing operations on the day. So a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered boats gives you 2 submarines on station. 24 conventionally powered submarines, which would cost you a lot less than the $368 billion, will give you 6 submarines on station. And remember, they're basically using the same sensors and firing the same weapons. So if it comes to, if you're in the target ship, you don't care whether the guy is about to launch the torpedo at you as in a nuclear or conventionally powered submarine. It's the same torpedo and it makes the same hole in your hull. So I think we for pure operational reasons, we'd be much better off with conventional boats.
There is a review going on, isn't there, of AUKUS?
Sorry?
Is it currently a review of AUKUS in Australia as well as the US?
There's a review of AUKUS in the US.
Yep.
And the focus of that review is very clear. And that is there are 2 reasons why, despite what our government keeps on saying, AUKUS is not in America's interest. It likes the idea, of course, that the strategic symbolism of committing Australia. That's at least the previous administration like that. I don't think Trump cares much about it one way or the other. But the big advantage for the United States, disadvantage for the United States, is that they don't have enough submarines of their own, and they can't build them as fast as they'd like. And every submarine they pass to Australia is 1 submarine fewer in the US Navy. And the sort of presumption, in a slightly emperor has no clothes kind of way, was that somehow they'd managed to increase their production rate to the point where they could provide the United States Navy with all the submarines they need and have some left over for us. And there's just no evidence of that happening. And so the US has to make a decision as to whether or not it's prepared to actually weaken its own submarine forces in order to give them to Australia. And that's something which sensible people in the Pentagon just think is a really stupid idea. And I think that's the conclusion I'll come up with. The second part of that, though, is that people have thought, in America, people have thought, well, look, it doesn't really matter if we have to pass some of our submarines to the Australians, because if we go to war with China over Taiwan, the Australians will send their submarines to support us. And, of course, that would be some consolation to America if an Australian government was prepared to come out loud and publicly and say, yes, that's what we'll do. But of course, that's not what any Australian government has been willing to do.
Well, that was what Richard Marles got close to doing.
Well, he got
back over his
and that is the context for Richard Marles' speech to the Australian Defence Conference last Monday. That is, I think what he was trying to do. I'm not putting words in his mouth here. I just read the speech and thought, why did he choose to say that now?
But also, there's.
I think he's trying to hint to Washington, you know, just to. I mean, Washington wants that much reassurance, and I think Marles was giving them that much, which was still more than he should have given, but I don't think nearly enough to solve the Washington's problem.
But in a way, I mean, there's no downside for Washington because they don't have to give us the subs anyway. So if we get to 2032 and they don't have the capacity, and I think you're talking about they need to be bringing online 2.3 new subs a year. They're producing 1.2. They're getting half the way just for their own needs.
Yes.
So there's zero chance they're going to get there.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, just last week, the US Navy was up on the Hill in Washington in Congress, spruiking their bid for next year's defence budget. And one of the head of naval acquisition was asked by one of the senators, so how's our plans for revitalising our shipbuilding and submarine building industry? And he said, I don't want to burble the guy, but this is pretty close to his exact words, oh, it's a complete disaster. No, we're way behind, we're way out of track, none of our plans are working. Now, of course, partly he was criticising the previous government, of course, the previous administration, but it's true. I mean, they've been talking about upping the submarine production rate for years, and nothing's happening. And it's just, so to speak, what you might call faith-based acquisition policy, that somehow something will turn up to make, a curve which has been very resolutely flat suddenly go like that,
So just going back to like the logical sort of things that flow from your essay. So you've painted this picture of this different world. And I guess I want to put you in the position now of saying you're advising a government on what to do, what to actually do, because you've been making these arguments for a lot of years, other people have been making them, they haven't been heard. You conclude the essay by talking about the debate and the discussion that we need to have and haven't really properly had. I guess my question is, if we're going to be uncoupling from America in some way, you don't want to do that in a big, flouncy, dramatic, negative way.
No.
Do we need to formally withdraw from AUKUS? Should we? Would you advise a government to actually cancel the arrangement?
From AUKUS? Look, I think I would actually. I think the fact is that AUKUS doesn't work for Australia and it doesn't work for the United States. And I think the best thing to do would be to go to the United States and say, look, we all make mistakes. We know this isn't working for you. I mean, just mount the argument we've just explored. We can see why this doesn't work for you. It doesn't actually work for us because in the end we've looked at it hard and we realise that nuclear-powered submarines are not the right answer for our force structure requirements. They're not what we need to do what we need to do. I actually think that would be a very refreshing thing to do. And actually, I think in Donald Trump's Washington, I think they'd say, oh, all right, yeah, good.
Okay.
Now, I mean, just to be clear, I'm not a feckless optimist. I don't for a moment think that that's what Richard Marles is going to do. I think what we're in fact going to do is to wait for Washington to do us a favour by...
So they'll kill it off quietly.
I think the most likely outcome of the present process in Washington is a warning letter that says, look, AUKUS is only going to work for us if our submarine production rate goes up and if you commit to going to war with China over Taiwan, and that puts the ball back into our court. But I think, let me make a broader point. I think we will not have the kind of defence relationship with the United States in the decades to come we've had in the past, because the United States will not be playing the same kind of role in Asia that it's played in the past, and our relationship with the United States has been a subordinate element of its broader posture in Asia. And it's not that I'm arguing that Australia should withdraw from ANZUS or withdraw from the relationship with the United States. The United States is withdrawing from the relationship. And in a sense, what the historians, when they look back at this era, will say, oh, okay, so the Americans actually, as China's military capability in Asia and the Western Pacific was going like that, America's military capability was going like that. That's what, to a future historian, that's what withdrawal looks like. It's not that America will withdraw, it is withdrawing. It just hasn't woken up to that fact yet. So I think we have to, we have to understand that. We have to recognise that whatever we do to manage the fact that we're moving from an Asia which was dominated and made safe for us by American power, and before that by British power, to an Asia which is dominated by Asian great powers, we're going to have to come to terms with how we make our way in that very different Asia without the support of an English-speaking Anglo-Saxon white, great and powerful.
That actually brings me to another really important question, I think, which is, you talk about the history of this idea of the special relationship with the United States and its cultural significance in Australia, the way it's sort of almost reified into something that is like an institution.
Yeah.
How do we get past that? Because it seems to me like one of the reasons for the political inertia you're talking about, you're saying that the evidence paints a picture of a changing world where we need to be doing things differently. We are unwilling to do things differently because we can't let go of this idea of this special relationship with the United States.
Yeah. Look, I think you're absolutely right. In a sense, the alliance with the United States is almost not a policy, it's part of us. And that makes one very pessimistic about our capacity to adjust. But it is worth bearing in mind that at different times in our history, we as a country have adapted to some very big shifts. I mean, we were 6 separate states and very committed to our separateness until it occurred to us in the late 19th century that actually that wasn't going to work very well. Amongst other things, it wasn't going to work very well at a time when Britain's global power was starting to fade, and we needed to get together so we could look after ourselves as one sovereign entity rather than 6. So we federated. At a later point in our history, we concluded after the Second World War that rather than focusing overwhelmingly on immigrants coming from Anglo-Saxon English-speaking countries, we diversify our source of migrants to a whole lot of still white, but people from a very wide range of different cultures and societies. Fundamentally changed the kind of country we were. A very revolutionary step to take. And then, not a moment too soon, a couple of decades later, we woke up to the fact that we should drop the White Australia policy and start welcoming migrants from a much wider range. Now, this was a fundamental shift in the way we thought of ourselves. And, when you think how deeply embedded the White Australia policy was in our national identity, and the fact that when the time came, when we woke up to the fact that, well, who knows if it ever worked, but it wasn't going to work in the future, you move past these things. Likewise, we had a long era of high levels of industrial protection, manufacturing protection in Australia. Then along came a new view. We thought that's not going to work for us, so we walked away from it. I think Australia can, so to speak, reinvent itself, but what we have to recognise is that when you're adapting to a shift as big as the shift we're seeing, and this is, I think, no exaggeration to say, we are going through one of, if not the biggest shift in Australia's international circumstances since European settlement. We're not going to come out of that the same way we went into it. We're going to be a different country. We have to think of ourselves in different kinds of ways. Now, what strikes me is that our political leaders, and again, I say it's on both sides of politics, have been very eager to embrace the economic opportunities that have been given by this massive shift in our economic circumstances, but have been extremely reluctant to acknowledge that an economic shift as fundamental as the rise of China and other Asian countries cannot occur without fundamental strategic shifts, and yet we've kept on hanging on to the idea that we can keep on relying on America forever. And what do we need to do? The first thing we need to do is for our leaders to acknowledge and to, if I can put it this way, educate us to the scale of those changes, the significance of those changes, and what it's got to mean for us. And a very important part of that is going to be to manage the disentanglement of our alliance with the United States. Because what we don't want to do is to walk out and slam the door.
No.
The United States is going to remain a very important country, and a country that with whom we're going to want to have a good relationship. Just as when the alliance with Britain collapsed, we actually moved to a post-alliance relationship with Britain, which has been pretty good.
Yeah.
Lots of connections with Britain. And if you think how strongly identified we were, my first passport had Australian citizen British subject, if you know what I mean. We were, to my parents' generation, we were British. And yet somehow, when that stopped being so, long, complex process, fall of Singapore was part of it, Britain entering the common market was another part of it. By the time you got to the late 60s, it was over. And yet somehow we managed that transition. We need to manage a similar kind of transition with America, and that is going to require a good deal of tact and forbearance and one thing and another, but you've got to start by actually acknowledging what's happening.
if you take the language of Hollywood, you would say it's like a conscious uncoupling.
That's it, yep.
We're going to start seeing other people.
That's right. Oh, well, now let me just be careful about that analogy. One of the great Australia is such an alliance-oriented country because of that history I mentioned before, that there's a kind of a tendency to think that we had the British, that worked nicely for a while, that stopped working, we swapped to America. And the thought that, well, if that stops working, we'll find someone else. I mean, you know, people do sometimes come to me and say, well, so should we think of China as our next ally? And I say, no. We're not going to have alliances like that anymore. It's just an accident of history that we've had two great and powerful friends, Menzies' famous phrase, which had those characteristics that I enumerated before. You know, we are now going to be a much more normal country. We're going to be like middle powers have been through history. You know, you've got to duck and weave, and you've got to be a little bit artful and sometimes a little bit Machiavellian. We're not going to have, you know, the old line about England has no permanent friends or permanent enemies, but only permanent interests. We're going to, you know, we're going to be a lot more on our own. But actually, you know, the odd thing is, you know, the title of the essay is Hard New World, but I don't think it's impossible for us to make this work. I'm not actually that pessimistic about it. At least I'm not pessimistic about it if only we woke up to what's happening and start adapting to new circumstances.
Okay. One last thing that we're going to have to wrap up, but somebody else who writes in this area about the relationship with the US, Emma Shortis, has released an essay at the same time as yours. And she talked about something that I think you talked about a little bit as well, which is climate change.
Yes.
Can you talk about the role of climate change as a strategic consideration?
Yeah. Look, it's a really interesting question, and I've got a lot of time for Emma and her essay, I might say. Yep. It's a really good piece of work, and she's a very important rising talent in this whole field. Look, I mean, I do touch on this. One of the things that has gone wrong from that soft old world of 2000, because in 2000 we did sort of understand that climate change was a bit of a deal, but there was a general sense, oh yeah, we'll be able to manage this. You know, we survived the Y2K millennial bug, we can survive anything sort of thing. Anybody remember that? Some of you do. So, showing my age. But you know, one of the great failures has been our failure to engage globally, I mean, as well as in Australia, with the challenge of climate change. And one of the reasons why what's happening in the United States is so important to Australia is, you know, not just as sort of spectators of US politics, though that's not a bad show in itself, but you know, I do think our chances of an effective global response to climate change, where the United States is not just not leading, but is actually throwing an anchor out the back of the boat, is is a whole separate story, but very serious. I mean, the second point I make is that there's often a tendency, and I sort of have this a bit myself, to sort of find it impossible to focus on the idea that two really bad things can be happening at once. And so sometimes you talk about, you know, the way in which the international order is changing, the rise of rivalry between great powers, the risk of a US-China conflict, and people say, oh yeah, but what about climate change? To which I say, yes, absolutely. That can go terribly wrong as well, but keeping both of those in mind at the same time and recognising how badly the escalating rivalry between the US and China, if the United States does, if I turn out to be wrong about America's withdrawal, and the United States does try and really push back against China the way the Australian government would like them to do, then the prospects for effective global action on climate change will go down even further. And the last point to make, and this is in some ways the most profound and most unknowable, is that our model for how strategic affairs works, how great power competition works, how great powers relate to middle powers and so on, has never had to accommodate an environmental catastrophe on the scale of what threatens if climate change isn't managed. Now, there's quite a lot of work gone on to kind of predict what the strategic implications of, you know, large-scale increases in temperatures would be. And I often focus on things like changes in food production and movements of, uncontrolled movements of people. And I think they're quite possible, but I think they actually reflect a little too little imagination I think it's, and so that, you know, this is not a very satisfactory answer in some ways, but I think in the face of really a major climate catastrophe, which I don't think at all is a remote possibility, I think an awful lot of the judgments we've made about how states relate to one another and how they use it in force in relation to one another would change. And I don't think any of those new facts would be anything other than a lot worse than what we've known. So it's just the two things interact in very unsatisfactory ways.
So we've managed to go from an optimistic note,
Oh, yes,
old,
no.
soft old world. We're in the grim new world where there's multipolar, there's nuclear weapons, there's climate change, and we're consciously uncoupling. That's pretty much the scenario. Look, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor Hugh White. It's fantastic to have him here. It's an absolute treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh and Misha. I think we promised compelling and thought-provoking in conversation, and I think you've certainly delivered much for all of us to think about tonight. Copies of Hugh's quarterly essay are available for purchase in the foyer, and Hugh will pop out there shortly to sign a few copies of the essay. Thank you all for attending the event tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at another Hawke Centre event very soon.